Here's Tim. He needs no further introduction. And let's go.
Good luck. Well, thank you very much, James. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you all. It's a chance for me to get out of my office where I don't get to talk about Ireland and come to people who are actually interested in Ireland. I would want to add just two things to what James just told you. The first is both my wife and I worked on Capitol Hill at earlier points in our life. Phone calls to the offices are the way to get noticed. That's not to say that a letter won't or that an email won't, but a phone call makes personal contact and the staffer has to log it in. So whatever the issue is, if you want to talk to your representative about it, use the phone if you feel comfortable doing that. The second is he was talking about the Catalpa incident and Fremantle in Australia. I have been to Fremantle in Australia. Literally every plant and animal there is trying to kill you. It's a very unpleasant place, so it's good that they got a boat. All right, I have to start first by saying again, I am speaking to you as a private citizen. My remarks and this presentation, which by the way, they have, if you want to download it and keep it, I make these presentations for the society. But what you will hear now is my own analysis. It does not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Naval War College, the U.S. Navy, the Department of the Navy, the Department of Defense, or any other organization of the U.S. government. These are my words and mine alone. What I'd like to talk about a little bit today is a project I'm working with Dr. Pat McCarthy, who's a member, one of the leading lights of the Military History Society of Ireland. We got asked to engage in a book project that is being edited by two of the professors at Great Britain's Military Academy at Sandhurst. And they were interested in getting chapters on withdrawal. And the main reason that they're interested in how nations withdraw from countries is because of recent events in Afghanistan and Iraq. And they're really looking at the modern era. But they left open this opportunity, and so Pat and I said, well, maybe the British should learn about their first great withdrawal, the first time where our British forces withdrew from a member of the empire, and that's in Ireland in 1922. And so what I'm going to be talking to you about today is more sort of a narrative, sort of the history of what happened in 1922. But the intent is to think ahead at least a little bit. We may be reflecting later on other experiences. I've got some conclusions at the end that are sort of tentative right now. But one of the reasons we might want to think about this is there may at some point in our future be another British Army withdrawal from Ireland. And that might be worth reflecting on as we think about the problems that occurred in this one. Now, sort of the bottom line up front, and I don't want to sound like an apologist for the British Empire, but they actually did this fairly well. They had a lot of planning, they had to get a lot of people moved, they had to get them out of Ireland on the timeline, and by and large, they did so fairly well, and they did not kill a lot of people, which was not what they had been doing in the previous 3 years. So that's all a plus. On the other hand, I'll talk about some of the contradictions at the end. They didn't do as well as they would have liked to. And those are things that we need to remember as we think about withdrawals and occupations again in the future. So, some background first. This problem all starts in around 1914. The Home Rule movement succeeds in passing a Home Rule bill. There's enormous division in Ireland in 1914. The British government is actually worried about a possible civil war between Unionists and Nationalists. Both have formed their own volunteer forces. And the British government is actually, in July, as the crisis breaks out in Europe, the Imperial General Headquarters staff sends a note to the cabinet and says, by the way, if civil war breaks out in Ireland, there are going to be 250,000 armed men in Ireland fighting one another, and it will take the entire British army to restore order. And at that point, World War I breaks out. And World War I probably keeps the Civil War from happening. It also creates an environment in which the Irish Home Rule Party tells all of its supporters that the best chance to reach Ireland's national aspirations is for them to volunteer to join the British Army and to fight with the British Army in the First World War, and that by showing their loyalty in this war, they will then be able to get not only their Home Rule Bill, but they'll be able to achieve even more politically and become more autonomous, and self-determination will be possible. Ireland contributed over 300,000 men to the First World War and suffered about 32,000 fatalities. So over 10% of the Irishmen who fought in the First World War died. And then, because of events that happened in the 1920s, Irish historians basically pushed that experience to the side, and it's only in the 21st century that now they're re-engaging with Ireland's participation in the First World War and what happened to the soldiers who came back in the aftermath. During the First World War, however, there were some elements of the Irish volunteers that did not choose to join the British Army and actually worked with the Irish Republican Brotherhood to stage a rising on the theory that England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. The best time to rebel against the British is when they're tied up in another war. And so you have the Easter Rising, which starts on Easter Monday in 1916 and lasts about a week. This is a photo of the devastation of downtown Dublin. Dublin was not actually repaired from the events of the Rising until the mid-1930s. The damage was enormous. Over 450 people were killed. Most of them were civilians. And the devastation was enormous. The volunteers, when they surrendered to the British Army, they were mocked by the people of Dublin. And the people of Dublin threw things at them because the feeling was that the volunteers had somehow done something not only illegitimate and illegal, but also just wrong. That opinion begins to turn around very quickly as the British begin to execute the leaders of the Rising. And over the course of about 2 weeks, they execute 15 leaders of the Rising, a couple at a time, through military courts that are clearly not objective. Everyone who goes before these military courts pretty much knows they're already guilty. And that sense of injustice really begins to turn Irish opinion against the British government by the end of May 1916. It's much quicker than is usually captured in the histories. The British try and adapt to this by again bringing up the issue of home rule and trying to come up with a settlement between Unionists and Nationalists in Ireland. That effort goes on for about 18 months and fails. And then in 1918, because of events in the First World War, the British government decides that it is going to try and enforce conscription in Ireland, something it has imposed in Wales and in Scotland and in England, but not in Ireland because of the potential political consequences. In April 1918, they pass a conscription bill that says we will draft Irishmen, but then they never pursue it. So they get the worst consequences of doing something, which is everyone in Ireland unites in a coalition against conscription, and the leader of that coalition is a new political party called Sinn Féin. Now, Sinn Féin has been around for a while, but up until the time of the conscription crisis, it basically got about as much political support as Ralph Nader does in the United States. I mean, it's literally in the single digits. They would occasionally elect someone onto the Dublin City Council, but they just weren't a big party. After the Easter Rising, which the British call the Sinn Féin Rebellion, Sinn Féin suddenly becomes the alternative, the anti-British political party. And they begin to gain momentum, they win by-elections, and they have been against conscription and warning the Irish people that conscription would come since 1914. So when it does come, they are the face of the protest against conscription, which buys them enormous political legitimacy. They effectively replace Irish nationalists, the Home Rule Party, and in the 1918 general election, the British have to hold an election right after the war is over, because by British law, you have to have an election every 5 years. And they had not had one since 1910. So as soon as the war ends, they have to have an election, Well, Sinn Féin wins over 70% of the Irish seats in the British Parliament. Ireland because Ireland is part of the United Kingdom under the Act of Union at this point, they have 105 seats in Parliament. Sinn Féin wins 73. The Irish Parliamentary Party, the Home Rule Party, wins 6. So it has been effectively eliminated. When the Sinn Féin members of Parliament meet, they meet in Dublin because they have chosen to boycott the British election and to try and use moral force to make the British adhere to Irish nationalist demands. This was part of the Sinn Féin policy from its formation in 1905. But now it's actually a fairly major moral stance because, again, 70 out of 500 or so members of Parliament in Westminster are not attending. And instead, they hold their own parliament in the Mansion House in Dublin, and they declare independence. And this is a list of many of the members of that first parliament, which in Irish is the Dáil, the first Dáil. This is actually not a picture of the members who were there at the first meeting of the Dáil, because the first meeting of the Dáil, out of 73 elected MPs, only 35 were able to appear, because the other 38 were either on the run or in prison. And when their name was called in the roll, they were entered as Feglasa Galif, imprisoned by the foreign enemy. Now, the most important members who were not there, you can see in the front row, yes, on your left, the second man in the front row is Michael Collins. He was not at the meeting, at the first meeting of the Dáil, even though he was an important member of the Irish nationalist movement, both of Sinn Féin, of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and of the Irish Volunteers. He was busy breaking out the guy who's in the middle of the front row, Eamon de Valera, out of prison in Lincoln in England. So he and Harry Boland are breaking de Valera out at the time of the first meeting of the Dáil. But then they show up later in April for other meetings of the Dáil, and that's where I'm assuming these pictures were taken. This is the beginning of a war of independence, and this war of independence escalates slowly and episodically. In 1919, despite the fact that we think of this as a revolutionary war, only 13 people are killed in 1919. 6 of them are policemen. The level of violence is quite low, and it's quite targeted, and it's quite deliberate. The levels of political mobilization and the radicalization of the Irish populace, however, is much more profound. One of the things that is determined by Sinn Féin to be the policy is that they will ostracize members of the police. Now, this is important because in Ireland, most of the police are Irish, and they live in their communities. So when you ostracize them, when you see them walking towards you on the street and you cross the street to avoid them, when they come into the pub and you leave the pub, when they come into Mass and you leave Mass, that has a real effect on morale, and it's a subtle way of radicalizing the Irish population to get them to a point where they're thinking of themselves more as a nation and more in terms of national resistance. That's what 1919 is for the most part. It's not violence, it's more political radicalization and mobilization, setting up alternative courts across Ireland that compete with the British legal system, setting up a Ministry of Finance that raises money through bonds and loans that then can pay for the operations of Sinn Féin and the Irish Volunteers. In 1920, the fighting begins to escalate. In 1920, the IRA begins attacking isolated police barracks in the countryside. These are usually about the size of a house and hold somewhere between 4 and a dozen policemen. They aren't able to take very many of them by force, but what they do by putting pressure on them is that the police then retreat to larger barracks where they're going to be safer, or they retreat to the cities where they're going to be even safer. And on April 15th, 1920, the IRA burns over 300 of these small little police barracks across the country. The British respond since they no longer are certain that an Irish police force will do the job that they need. They add new organizations, the Black and Tans and the Auxiliaries. These are using British Army veterans to feed into the Irish police system as new recruits in the case of the Black and Tans, or as separate elite units in the case of the Auxiliaries. because of this, violence begins to spiral. It spirals through November of 1920, when you get Bloody Sunday and Kilmichael, the first Bloody Sunday, which happens in Dublin. The burning of Cork in December. At the end of 1920, you have the Government of Ireland Act and martial law. And this is very important for understanding what happens next. In December 1920, when Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom, as far as the British are concerned, they partition the island. A separate parliament is established for Northern Ireland and for Southern Ireland, the 6 counties and the 26 counties. Under British law, that's done. There will not be a united Ireland. And when Ireland tries to negotiate over this, they run into a brick wall in 1921. In early 1921, the British reinforce. They begin carrying out a much more brutal campaign. The number of Crown forces deployed in 1921, including the police, gets up to about 70,000. There are more people killed in the first 6 months of 1921 than there are in the entire rest of the conflict from 1919 till Christmas 1920. And they're more by a substantial amount. Violence is getting really ugly, and neither side really either has a military solution or knows exactly what to do about it. And as a result, through a series of sort of interesting activities, they decide to call a ceasefire and maybe see if they can't negotiate things out. Now, the British are thinking, well, we were already going to give Ireland home rule, so maybe we can give them home rule and this will end. Irish revolutionaries, however, have a much broader range of objectives, with the most extreme being a unified republic, and the least extreme being, again, something like home rule or self-determination. This is a famous painting by Sean Keating. It's called Men of the South. It was based on portraits that he took of 6 IRA men in January of 1922, so during peacetime. But then he painted this from those photographs, and it's one of the most iconic photographs of the IRA at war during this period. Iconic portraits, excuse me. In 1921, then, a truce is declared, and Eamon de Valera, the head of the Irish government, goes to London in July, and then continues a correspondence with David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of England, through September of 1921. They don't agree. They simply don't. Lloyd George finds de Valera extremely annoying, which I think most people did. De Valera finds Lloyd George to be conniving and sneaky and untrustworthy, which I think, again, most people did. So they decide in the end they will work out, because they can't agree on language, right? Things like republic or independence or what role you have in the empire, they just literally can't agree on that. So Lloyd George says, why don't we try and negotiate something? And he uses the most vanilla term possible, which is how the association of Ireland with the community of nations known as the British Empire may best be reconciled with Irish national aspirations. In diplomacy, when you don't know what you're doing, you fudge it and try and see what happens. And that is what they do. And this is the Irish team that went to negotiate. In the front row, you can see Arthur Griffith, the founder of Sinn Féin, Eamon Duggan, who was for a brief time the director of intelligence for the Irish Republican Army, Michael Collins in the center, who at this point was the president of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, Minister of Finance for the government of Ireland, Director of Intelligence for the Irish Republican Army, and basically was running things in Ireland to a great extent through sheer force of personality and will. And in the far right, you have Robert Barton. And then in the back, Erskine Childers, Gavin Duffy, who had been an ambassador to a couple of countries for Sinn Féin during the War of Independence, and Sir John Charteris. The Irish delegation comes in and demands full independence, and are told that that's not going to happen. As far as the British are concerned, partition is non-negotiable. Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, in British eyes, exist, and the only way in which Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland can be united is if they both agree to it. That becomes a real stumbling block for anyone espousing a 32-county republic. The British basically say, you will not get that in this negotiation. De Valera has a backup plan, which is not republicanism, because De Valera was not a doctrinaire Republican. De Valera was a clever Machiavellian guy who had his own ideas about what was best. And in this case, what he wants is external association, so that Ireland gets the equivalent of dominion status, like Canada, like Australia, like New Zealand, but it is not formally part of the empire. It is part of a community of nations, but not a member of the empire, right? These are subtle diplomatic distinctions, but they're ones that express a range of Irish desires for autonomy and self-determination away from the British Empire, that the British Empire and the leaders of the British Empire simply don't understand and can't understand. It is cognitive dissonance, right? This is a real clash. Now, both of those options had been raised when De Valera went to talk to Lloyd George and in the correspondence afterwards. And Lloyd George had made sure that De Valera knew that neither of those was going to happen. Neither external association nor the Republic. The British government would give Ireland peace and would give Ireland autonomy and self-determination on its own rules. And the rules that mattered most to the people who were making the decisions in London were, you're going to be part of the empire and you're going to swear an oath to the king. Because that's what people in the empire do. That's what the Dominion in Canada does. It's what the Dominion in Australia does. It's what the Dominion in New Zealand does. It's what the Dominion in South Africa does. It's even what the Dominion in Newfoundland does, because Newfoundland and Canada were separate dominions at the time. This is what you're going to do. De Valera doesn't go to London, probably at least in part because he knows he's not going to get what he wants. And instead, he sends a negotiating team to go to London to get the best deal that they can. The charitable explanation for why this happens, because we really don't know, is that maybe De Valera was hoping that if things got to a crisis and it looked like war was going to break out, he could call the delegation back and he could propose external association again as a compromise. And that maybe the British would blink at that point. It's not clear that that's what he had in mind. He didn't tell the delegation that that was what he had in mind. And it's not clear the British would have blinked. But that is the best explanation I can come up with for why De Valera does the things that he does. The negotiations focus on a few points. The relationship to the British Empire. Dominion status at that point was fairly narrow, but the Irish side believed it could really push the boundaries of Dominion status and over time make it de facto independence. So they were taking a gamble that this would work out. And for the British, Dominion status, again, part of the empire. The recognition of the British monarchy with an oath of loyalty to the king, that oath is actually diluted. And the people who dilute it, interestingly enough, are the Supreme Council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Because when Collins comes back in early December and says, this is the oath they want us to swear, I might be able to write a better one. De Valera says, let's see what you got. And so Collins goes to the Supreme Council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which is the extreme organization that has been espousing an Irish republic for 60 plus years. And he says, if we have to give an oath to the king, how can we write it in a way that works for us? And that is the text of the oath to the king in the actual treaty. That's not enough to persuade a lot of people, but it's interesting that you have that kind of interplay. Military security is a big deal because the First World War just ended. The British want some Irish bases because Irish bases were really important to fight the German submarine campaign. And in fact, the American Navy shows up in Cork in 1917 with a large number of anti-submarine vessels to help the British fight that war. So the British want to maintain naval bases. The British want to make the Irish pay for everything, and actually this is an area where they make significant concessions in the treaty negotiations. That Ireland is not going to be held responsible for large portions of UK debt. And finally, you have partition. They haggle about these things for 2 months, and finally, under a threat of immediate and terrible war, where David Lloyd George holds 2 letters up in the air and he says, which one do you want me to send? Right? One means war, the other means peace. At that point, the negotiating team goes back to its quarters. They vote 3-2 in favor of bringing this treaty home and giving it to the Irish Dáil to vote on. Eventually all 5 sign because the British basically say it's not valid if you don't all sign. But it's a divided vote. They come home, they meet with the cabinet, which again is a divided vote of 4 votes to 3 to put this in front of the Irish Dáil. De Valera's on the losing side. This was a case where he overestimated how much influence he would have in the cabinet. Then there are several weeks of debate and a Christmas holiday at the Dáil, and a vote is taken on the 7th of January 1922, where the Dáil, all of whom are doctrinaire Republicans, votes 64 to 57 in favor of a treaty that allows partition. Right? So Ireland is deeply divided at this time. And this is the circumstance in which the British and the Irish government and the Irish people now have to figure out what happens next. Arthur Griffith becomes the new president of the Dáil. Michael Collins becomes the head of the provisional government. And in this period, from January until his death in August of 1922, Collins really becomes a dominant figure in Ireland, in Irish politics, more so than in the War of Independence. He has now become the key negotiator with the British government, and he's also the key negotiator with the new Parliament in Northern Ireland and with anti-treaty factions inside Ireland. So he's juggling a lot of balls in the air at this point. This was the Dáil debate. It was not held in Mansion House, which is where the Dáil had been meeting in Ireland, because Mansion House apparently had an agricultural session or something going on. So they held it in what was the home of University College Dublin at the time. And now I believe it's the Opera House in Dublin. Now, from a British point of view, treaty politics look like this. They take the treaty to Parliament, and they win a 302 to 60 vote. So the British government approves the treaty, but there's a lot of loud complaining about it, okay? I know you've heard this before. Governments don't like to negotiate with terrorists. As far as the British government was concerned, what they're doing is extremely radical. Now, it only is happening because the government is an interesting coalition government. The Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, is a member of the Liberal Party. But in this coalition, only about 20 to 25% of the members of the ruling government are liberals. The rest are all conservatives. And at this time, the name of the Conservative Party, and I believe this is still true today, is the Conservative and Unionist Party. So in order to get this passed, they have to bring the Conservative Party along with them. And they have to assure them that this is the best thing. It's a difficult and testy debate. And David Lloyd George's rule as Prime Minister pretty much rests on this. The 60 who voted against it really don't like it and would form the backbone of a successor government if the Lloyd George's government falls, which would probably then crack down on Ireland even harder. So in British politics, something we don't talk a lot about in Irish history, in British politics, this is a pretty critical time for the British. It's a very difficult decision. They also have some legal problems and structural problems. The British government doesn't accept the Dáil as a body, even though the Dáil was elected in May of 1921 as part of the new election. What the British are looking for is, what's the Parliament of Southern Ireland? It's not clear. It's not the Dáil. So what they end up doing is the Parliament of Southern Ireland meets once. Because under British law, there is a Parliament of Southern Ireland. That Parliament of Southern Ireland is the pro-treaty members of Sinn Féin and the 4 members who are elected from Trinity University. Because the university gets its own 4 members of Parliament. They're all unionists, but they vote for the treaty. This second Parliament meets once and then never meets again, and they basically say Michael Collins is making all the decisions for us. This is a problem for the British government that they have to fudge. And what they end up saying is that, okay, well, this provisional government is going to be an ad hoc advisory board to the Viceroy, because they don't want to have to go to Parliament to get funding for everything that the new provisional government wants to do. Now, that sounds sort of ad hoc from a British perspective. From an Irish perspective, it's proving what the people who were arguing for the treaty had already been saying. That Dominion status had a lot more flexibility in it. That already in February of 1922, they're getting powers and authorities that other dominions don't have. And this is part of a constant testing policy by Irish politicians under every government from this point on until 1937, when they rewrite the Constitution. All of the Irish politicians are trying to push the boundaries of Dominion status towards independence as rapidly as possible. And they'll eventually get something like it with the Dominion Act in 1931. The British, on the other hand, also are allowing Northern Ireland's government to make decisions on security. And this is a real problem. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, but it has much more autonomy than any other part of the United Kingdom, and it is allowed to make decisions on policing, on security, on imprisonment, on human rights, and it exercises that leeway extremely aggressively, leading up to the adoption of the Special Powers Act in 1922, which the apartheid government in South Africa tries to emulate in 1960, because they think this is the model of how to govern. So Britain is trying to manage this, but it has less control over either government than it thought it does, and as a result, it also has less control over security than it thought it would have. And that will be important as we lead up to the Civil War. De Valera and Collins become opponents. De Valera tries to form a political party called Clan na Poblachta, which is going to be a Republican opposition party to oppose the pro-treaty party. This gets wrapped up in a bunch of other things, though, as the Civil War begins to develop. De Valera is not able to really build a political movement. Opposition to the treaty increasingly falls into the vector of the anti-treaty Irish Republican Army. And political opposition is not their priority. They are thinking of violent opposition. In December 1921, right after the treaty comes back to Ireland, key units oppose the treaty, including the 1st and 2nd Southern Divisions of the IRA. These constitute about 40% of the manpower of the IRA, and they're in the areas where the most intense fighting, other than Dublin, was carried out. These are Cork, Kerry, Tipperary. Most of the IRA General Headquarters staff from Dublin supports the treaty. So that split that you saw in the politics of the treaty, in the votes, is mirrored to a great extent within the IRA leadership and the IRA rank and file. It's unclear exactly how many members of the IRA rank and file oppose the treaty. Probably 60 to 80% opposed the treaty. And in March 1922, over the objections of the government, the IRA who opposed the treaty call an army council. They elect a new executive, and they say that they will not obey the government, that they are loyal to the Republic, they are the voice of the Republic, and they're not quite sure what they're going to do next. But they know that they will not be the army of the Free State. Here we see actually speakers at the Army Council, at that Army Council convention in March. As we think about the agendas of these factions as they start to emerge, and I've only got 3 of the factions on here because I couldn't figure out a way to squeeze the government of Northern Ireland on and still make it readable. But the British want to get their troops out as quickly as possible. That's what military withdrawals are about. Get your troops out of danger. They want to bolster the provisional government in the Free State because they think that is what will create the stability that will allow them to get their troops out quickly. And they want to maintain peace on the border because as part of the treaty between Northern and Southern Ireland, Northern Ireland has the right to opt out of an all-Ireland parliament, which they immediately do, right, with a unionist majority and a gerrymandered representation. the Unionists do what they want in Northern Ireland at this time. But there is a border commission will be established that will work out the final contours of the border that is supposed to meet sometime after both of these new parliaments have become officially approved, sometime after December 1922. So the British, some in the Liberal Party, still thought that this border commission might be a way of adjusting the border, especially in areas like Tyrone and Fermanagh, in favor of the new Free State. That much of the territory that had a heavy Catholic majority would go over to the Free State as part of this border renegotiation. The provisional government needs to build a new army and a new police force because the British Army is going to withdraw and the police force has been disbanded. And crime is a problem in 1921 and 1922 in Ireland. More people with guns, less law and order, the political system or the political situation is unstable and uncertain. People are resorting to crime. And there's more of it in 1922 than anybody's comfortable with. They have to create a constitution, and they want to create a Republican constitution. They want to try and push the boundaries again and create a constitution for the new Free State that gets more than what the British actually gave them at the peace table. And they spend a lot of time working on this and trying to engineer it using diplomatic language that'll somehow sort of sneak under the radar. They want to avoid a civil war because their friends, their colleagues, people that they fought with against the British now are armed and oppose the government. And they want to find a way to bring those people back into the fold somehow, or at least avoid outright conflict. And last but not least, underappreciated, Collins doesn't want to make any other concessions on Northern Ireland. He's willing to talk to Craig, and he and Craig lie to each other several times. They come to false agreements that neither of them is actually going to keep. But Collins isn't going to give an inch on Northern Ireland, and it is a priority for him, especially leading up until May. Now, the anti-treaty IRA, they want to restore public allegiance to the Republic. They want to unify the army so that they don't have to fight their colleagues, they can fight the British, and they want to break the treaty. All right? There's going to be tension between those three groups. The fourth group, Northern Ireland, they want to keep what they have, and they don't want anyone interfering with them, basically, is their viewpoint. Here's a timeline of some British Army movements in Ireland. As you can see, starting in January, on January 17th, they start moving and figuring out how to get troops out of places. And they actually have most of their troops relocated by April. So it's a period of 3 months. You've got barracks all over Ireland that are being evacuated. And Ireland is a very heavily garrisoned and heavily militarized place at this time. There are 54 major barracks in Ireland that the British are going to give up. The priority, General Macready, the commander of forces in Ireland, said evacuation should be begun as soon as possible, and we'll hope that the last of the soldiers might be cleared out by the spring. Churchill, on the other hand, who is in charge of Irish policy because he is the Secretary for Colonial Affairs, and he grabs this portfolio for Ireland, says, yeah, we should make it look like we're going to withdraw our forces. But Churchill believes that we probably want to kind of dally on moving some of these forces because the Irish are going to ask us to help them, right? It's quite possible that in 2 or 3 months, insistent demands will be made for some of them to stay permanently. Now, Churchill was obsessed with Ireland his entire political career. He participated in some things that were good for Ireland, but he showed a persistent ability to misjudge the Irish, despite his interest in them. And this is a case in a nutshell that I think really captures it. This idea that he thought that after a war and after a treaty where the British were going to withdraw their forces from Ireland, the Irish would say, oh no, you can keep them here anyway? That's astonishingly naive for a man of his reputation and caliber. You see the withdrawal here from Athlone in February 1922. These folks start moving out really quickly. And part of the reason they can do this is the British Army is a colonial army. units of the British Army periodically are told, pack up, you're going to India in a week. And they know how to do it. They have the standard operating procedures that would allow them to get everybody ready, get all the gear into wagons, and move out. So what they're doing is they are marching across the countryside in formation. Each soldier has their weapon and 50 rounds of ammunition. Most of the baggage is being moved by train, but it's like a train schedule. These guys are just really good at this. It's what the British Army has done for a century and a half. So the first step is all of the barracks in the countryside will be evacuated and all of the troops will be concentrated in 3 places: Dublin, Cork, or the Curragh, which is near Newbridge in Kildare, about 30 miles from Dublin, is the major military facility. And then the next phase will be that Cork, Curragh, and Dublin will be evacuated. Now, as it turns out, Cork and Curragh were evacuated first, in part because communications were getting increasingly difficult as the Civil War became more and more imminent, and as the Irish government was unable to repair damage that had been done to roads and to train networks. Curragh was fairly isolated, and Cork was in the middle of the most significant anti-treaty areas, so they don't want to keep troops there. When they get them to Cork, they get them on a boat as soon as they can. Dublin, on the other hand, is an area where they keep a substantial force in place for a time. The barracks are going to be handed over to the Irish governments. The idea is that they'll hand it over to local commanders. The problem is that because the IRA is in the process of splitting, the government doesn't always know if the local commanders are going to be loyal or not, or may not be able to get loyal commanders in place. So many of the barracks are captured by anti-treaty IRA, who then use this as a way of getting weapons and ammunition and establishing local control. And it creates increasing political instability in Ireland, even though, for the most part, fighting isn't going on between pro and anti-treaty sides at this point. This is an example. The dark blue area down at the bottom is Cork. That's where the biggest concentration of military facilities are. Dublin on the coast is the next biggest concentration, and that lighter blue next to it is Kildare, which is where the Curragh is. So you can see that there's a lot of bases here. This includes things like firing ranges and other things, as well as barracks. But they are moving people out quickly in 1922, and quickly and early. There's 57,000 troops in Ireland in October of 1921. They begin with symbolic movements. Dublin Castle, the center of British administration, is handed over on the 16th of January 1922. The treaty was passed on the 7th by the Dáil. 9 days later, the provisional government is in charge of Dublin Castle. 2 weeks after that, they take over Beggar's Bush Barracks in Dublin, which is the headquarters of the British Army in Dublin. So these are symbolic moves, but they're also powerful evidence of British commitment to get out. By the end of February, 37 of the 54 major barracks are evacuated, and phase 1 is completely finished by late April, with the remaining troops in Cork, Curragh, and Dublin. This is Michael Collins coming out of Dublin Castle, having just taken over the keys. And this is members of the National Army marching into Beggar's Bush Barracks, and thus becoming the first Irish Army garrison in Dublin and the representative of the government. They got those uniforms were nice and spiffy, were brand new. Some key events in the British withdrawal. There's a lot that's going on in the background, and particularly between March and August of 1922, things get sticky for the British. The IRA splits into pro and anti-treaty factions, and these become increasingly isolated, although the leaders of some of these sides are meeting constantly, trying to find ways to not only keep the peace, but also find a way to reunify the IRA somehow. Richard Mulcahy is the head of the pro-treaty forces and the National Army. Liam Lynch is the head of an important faction of the anti-treaty forces, the former commander of the 1st Southern Division. He's Cork-based. But there's also a Dublin contingent that is even more radical, that is anti-treaty, that is led by Rory O'Connor and Liam Mellows, among others. Sinn Féin effectively splits into pro and anti-treaty factions, so Irish unity on the political front has dissolved. On the military front is fraying. The British notice this, but they don't really know what to do about it. It's complicated by violence on the border, IRA raids in the north, and by violence in Belfast, which in theory, Britain should be able to do something about, because Belfast and Northern Ireland are parts of the United Kingdom, but they have ceded control of security to the Northern Irish Parliament. And the Northern Irish Parliament is being vindictive and heavy-handed in its approach to any kind of political resistance. One thing that is happening is that the British are providing weapons to the National Army. These are lists of some of the weapons that have been provided to the Irish Free State by September 1922. To put that 27,000 rifles in perspective, the IRA had 600 rifles at the time of the truce in July 1921. They had less than 3,000 rifles at the time of the treaty in December 1921. The British supply 9 times as many rifles to the Irish Army as the IRA had at the beginning of 1922. Significant. 4.7 million rounds of ammunition. That's more ammunition, trust me on this, than the IRA ever had access to, by a factor of probably 500%. Machine guns, field artillery, these become critical in the Civil War. There aren't very many field guns. They aren't really big guns, but if one side has artillery and the other side doesn't, it's a grave disadvantage. And armored vehicles. We don't think about this much, but armored cars and armored trucks. Armored trucks allow you to move troops quickly under protection. Armored cars are more like tanks, and they are very effective and very important during the Civil War. So this slows the British evacuation phase 2. And it slows it in a weird way. There's about 10,000 troops in Dublin. There are twice as many British troops in Dublin as there are in the entire Irish National Army at the end of June 1922. That's a lot of bodies, and these are things we just don't really know or think about. They're being kept there by political leadership. The military and some of the civil servants have said, we should get them out of here, this could be a problem. But political leadership, and especially Churchill, wants to keep them there in case they are needed to influence political events inside the Free State. That National Army was formed in January 1922. It's mostly pro-treaty IRA at first, but they begin recruiting ex-British soldiers. Now, these are the ex-British soldiers, the 300,000 guys that served in the First World War. They are not necessarily any less patriotic than any other soldier in Ireland at this time. It's just that because of the constitutional situation of Ireland, because they had been urged by their political leaders to volunteer, they had served in the British Army for a while and they had skills. The Irish new National Army wants those skills. And so some estimates of the number of British veterans who serve in the Irish Armed Forces between 1922 and 1926, about 60,000 Irishmen serve in the armed forces. Some estimates say about 50% of them are British Army veterans. And this may explain a great deal about the outcome of the Civil War, that the Irish Army has access to trained personnel that the anti-treaty IRA does not. You have the Upnor incident in March, where anti-treaty IRA and Cork basically steal a boat. The British pack a boat full of weapons and ammunition and explosives, and they're going to sail it back to England, and the IRA hijacks it and takes all the stuff. That's embarrassing. You also have a big, important clash between pro and anti-treaty forces in Limerick in March 1922 as the British Army evacuates Limerick. The two sides almost go into a major armed clash, and then back away at the last moment. Liam Lynch arranges a ceasefire. You have the four courts then are occupied by especially the Dublin radical faction of the anti-treaty IRA in early April. And then you have even more armed clashes where 18 people are killed between pro and anti-treaty forces in Kilkenny in May of 1922. So as the British are watching, violence is escalating between pro and anti-treaty forces, and the British aren't sure who's going to win, which is one of the reasons Winston Churchill wants to keep a whole bunch of guys in Dublin in case the British have to influence the outcome. These are the four courts in nicer times. They're seized by the anti-treaty IRA in April. It holds them until the end of June, basically. You have problems in the north, and these problems exacerbate the Civil War in the south. There's no truce in Northern Ireland. About almost 500 people are killed from mid-1920 to mid-1922. And that means with a smaller population base in a 2-year period, this is as violent as all but 2 years during the Troubles. It's a significant amount of deaths, and they're disproportionately Catholic. The IRA launches a northern offensive in May 1922. This is an attempt by the leadership of the anti-treaty and the pro-treaty IRA to find something they can cooperate on. And the thing that they can cooperate on is the North. They all want the North back. And so for 2 months, as British guns are coming to the Irish National Army, the Irish National Army is handing over its old stocks of guns to the anti-treaty IRA, who is sending them to Northern Ireland for this offensive, right? These guys are like this when they want to be. However, it is very unsuccessful. The IRA in the North just isn't that strong, and the repressive forces in the North, the police and security forces, are extremely capable, they're extremely numerous, and they're extremely savage. So the IRA offensive fizzles in May of 1922. There's even this very interesting moment where the IRA comes across the border at the junction of Balik and Pedigo in June 1922. And at that point, that is the one point where the British Army gets significantly engaged because they treat it as an invasion. And they put thousands of troops with armored cars and artillery, and they literally blow the IRA out of both of the towns, go across the border into what would be the Free State, and hold that territory for a little while to indicate that this is not something that should happen again, and then retreat back to the north. That's important and probably underappreciated because it shows that if you meet the British Army in conventional battle, the Irish are unlikely to do well. They knew that from the Easter Rising, but this is important to remember because a lot of the argument over the treaty debate was whether the IRA was winning militarily, and there was a strong debate about that. In conventional battle with large numbers, the British Army is an extremely good army at this time, and the IRA has neither the training or the equipment to stand up in this way. Churchill is looking at that large force. Oh, this is a photo of the Weaver Street attack in February 1922 in Northern Ireland. 6 children are killed. The Special Powers Act comes in April of 1922. It allows for punishments including the death penalty and flogging and internment without trial. The internment without trial is what is used in Northern Ireland, both in the 1940s, in the 1950s in Operation Harvest, and in the late 1960s and early 1970s at the beginning of the Troubles. It's based on this law. Now, there is a crisis in 1922, and this is sort of where I'm going to end the story to some extent. Because after this, it becomes a story about the Civil War. But this is a pivotal moment in the history of Ireland and in the history of Ireland and England. In late May, early June 1922, Collins comes to the British with his constitution, and the British say, no way. We can read between the lines. We know a Republican constitution when we see it. You will have an oath to the king. You will adhere strictly to the treaty. You will adhere to the treaty as we interpret it. And that's the constitution you're going to get. And basically spank him and send him home. So the Constitution is rewritten in a way that is approved by the British government and not released to the Irish people until the morning of the election on the 15th of June. So nobody knows what they're voting for. Collins has been saying all along that he would get a Republican Constitution, but it's not a Republican Constitution. The elections return a very strongly pro-treaty government. Anti-treaty candidates get about a quarter of the seats in Parliament. and other parties for whom the treaty is either something they support or not something that they think is that important win the rest of the votes. And that makes the anti-treaty forces look weaker than they thought they were. They thought they would have more public support. So the anti-treaty IRA immediately has a vote. They call another Army Council, and Tom Berry, one of the most famous commanders from West Cork, proposes that the IRA give the British government 72 hours to leave all of Ireland. And if not, that a state of war would be declared. They vote on this, and in the first vote, it appears that the IRA votes in favor of declaring war on Britain. But there's a procedural irregularity, so they take a second vote, and this time it loses by about a dozen votes. But the anti-treaty IRA then splits, with the more radical Dublin faction staying in the four courts and Liam Lynch and others leaving the four courts. And that looks like it might be a permanent split at this point. These two sides have diverged. One side really wants to fight Britain now. They see that as the only way to maintain the anti-treaty cause. The other, under Lynch, is still more moderate and is still trying to find some other way to resolve this. This all comes to a head on the 22nd of June, 1922, when in London, Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson is assassinated by two members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Nobody still knows exactly what happened here. I mean, they know about how the shooting took place, but it's unclear if this was ordered by Collins, if it had been ordered by Collins during the War of Independence, if it was an independent operation. There's a good book that just came out by Ronan McGreevy, which covers a lot of the turf, but still doesn't, I think, come up with an answer. What matters is that the British government sees this as an assault on Northern Ireland, because Sir Henry Wilson is a member of Parliament from Northern Ireland, but also on the entire peace process. And they blame it on the radicals in the four courts, even though they have no evidence to base that on. This is what the election result looks like. The blue dots are anti-treaty Sinn Féin. Everybody else, which forms a coalition that is pro-treaty and supports the ongoing process, is in other colors. Yellow is the pro-treaty Sinn Féin faction. The other ones are farmers groups. Red is Labour. But there was a substantial turnout and a substantial vote in favor of continuing with the treaty process. This is one of my favorite photos. This is the IRA patrolling, the anti-treaty IRA patrolling Grafton Street in June of 1922, just days before the Civil War breaks out. It's not really clear what they're up to. There are guys with guns who are roaming the streets, and it has this kind of Wild West feel to it. But it gives you an idea of how tense the situation was in Dublin before the fighting breaks out. Because of Wilson's assassination, Churchill orders the army in Dublin to attack the four courts. On the 23rd, he says, I want an attack on the 25th, and they already have a plan in place. Because they're an army, they plan for this stuff. So they've made plans in early May about what are we going to do if we have to go in against the four courts. And they've got it all, on a timeline. They're going to use a lot of artillery. They're going to use some tanks, like real tanks. They're going to go in force. They're going to go in hard. They're going to go in heavy. The plan is much more sophisticated than the plan that the National Army uses just a few days later. This is the British Army doing British Army stuff. But Macready says this is a bad idea. He says, look, the IRA may be split right now into three factions, not two, right? One's the government and these other two. We're going to have civilian casualties. It's going to happen. Can't avoid it. The four courts are downtown. They're in a major inhabited area of Dublin. He's like, if we have some big civilian casualties and the British Army does it, that's bad, right? It's going to delegitimize the provisional government, which we are counting on to carry through on the treaty. And if they have to immediately turn to us to do their dirty work for them, they don't look legitimate at all. And finally, it may reunite all these Republicans, right? Fighting the British had all these guys working together in the first place. If we declare war on Dublin, we may lose the government, we may be back at war. And he reminds them of what that war would have looked like, because they talked about this before the truce in June 1921, where they talked about a major escalation. Talking about probably 100,000 troops, as opposed to the 57,000 they actually had in October, so double the number of troops. Churchill had talked about executing hostages in retaliation for deaths. 4 to 5 hostages for every one English or English supporter death would probably calm the rebellion pretty quickly. Macready, the general, said, is Parliament ready to see perhaps hundreds of executions a week? I mean, they're talking about really bloody stuff. And that's one of the reasons they decided for a truce, was that they weren't sure they wanted to go here. But that's the alternative they were talking about. And what Macready is worried about is, if I use the army now, this may be where we have to go in order to restore order, because we may break everything in the treaty process and have to rebuild from the ground up. There's your tank. I had to put a tank in. Now, Macready actually wins this argument. And one of the key things that he does that helps win the argument is he sends one of his staff colonels to London. And the colonel just makes this really impassioned argument. He says, look, I know you want to find blame for Wilson, but we have no evidence that the anti-treaty IRA did this. None. Zero. There is no evidence. We're interrogating the prisoners now. There's no evidence that they've been in touch with O'Connor. You can't make that case. It won't hold up. And he buys time. And what the British say instead is, all right, we will ask the provisional government to manage this problem. It is unacceptable at this point for the government that we are working with to allow a band of armed men to occupy the legal center of downtown Dublin, and you've got to fix it. And this is how the Civil War starts. On June 28th, the National Army with British provided artillery shells the four courts. British provide both the guns, and they provide very little ammunition, and then the Irish come running to them and say, we need more ammo. So they provide more ammunition. Actually, one of the first shots that's fired from these guns actually sails over the four courts and to the barracks, which is the headquarters of Dublin at this time. It's now Fort McKee in Dublin. It actually hits a British fort, and they have to apologize for it because the Irish were not expert gunners at this time. The Civil War begins now, and the British wisely step back from it. They provide arms. They provide some naval support in terms of patrolling the coast so that smuggling can't happen, especially smuggling of arms. They do, however, and this is something I want to follow up on because this is something I need to pull this thread further. There is indirect support that's provided for the Free State when it goes into Cork and Kinsale with a naval assault. The British apparently help by removing mines that had been put in the water by the IRA, and maybe by clearing one of the channels. And the reason that I want to pull this thread a little bit is because the guy who's in command of the Royal Navy in Cork at that time is a fellow named Commander Somerville. 14 years later, when he is a retired admiral, the IRA executes him. I'm not sure if there is a connection between those two things. The IRA said that the reason they executed him was that he was providing recommendations to young Irishmen to join the Royal Navy, which they also felt was inappropriate. But it may be that it's a little bit more personal. I just don't know. This gun is the gun that fired the first shot at the four courts. The Irish Army has recovered it. It was at a conference I was at in Cork in 2023. Do you know where they found this gun? Does anybody want to take a guess? Where would you find guns if you were looking for guns on this planet?
In a church.
Good guess. Close. First off, in America, in Virginia, outside a diner. Because you've all driven past these places. At one point we had a whole bunch of war material and people just put stuff in the front yard because it was cool. You could buy a deactivated gun for, I don't know, some small amount of money. And so American legions have guns, and bases have guns, and playgrounds have helicopters, and this diner had this gun, and somebody looked at it and said, wow, that's an 18-pounder. And they looked at the serial number and they went, oh my gosh, And so the Irish Army bought it and brought it back. I've talked to the officer, that gentleman spent years restoring it very lovingly. But that's the gun, and there's the forecourts. You see those two bridges? There was a gun at the left end of each of those bridges. That was the battlefield at the forecourts. So these guys were firing from a couple hundred yards away, not quite over open sights, but it was a very close battle, and they were within range of snipers to be there. But that's how the Civil War started. Now, the Civil War, I've talked about here before, very briefly. Collins assumes executive powers. He becomes the commander-in-chief in July 1922, and is then killed in mid-August 1922 in an ambush. Emergency legislation is passed by the new heads of the government in September 1922 because although the IRA is no longer able to hold cities or fight in the field, they're fighting an ugly guerrilla war in places like Sligo and Kerry, especially Cork, on the west coast and the southwest coast. So the emergency legislation allows for the execution of prisoners. In October of 1922, the government offers an amnesty to the IRA and says, you're not going to win, let's call it off, come in from the fields and let's end it. The IRA continues to struggle. Liam Lynch is determined now as the commander to continue the fight. And so in November 1922, the Irish government starts executing IRA prisoners. A total of, I think the number now is 86, but it's probably more than that. 86 IRA prisoners are executed by the government, which is more than the number that the British government executed during the War of Independence. The Irish Free State's officially declared in December 1922, and then from January to April, the Irish Army mops up the rest of the IRA over time. It's not a nice struggle. At the end, in April 1923, there are 12,000 Republicans being interned without trial at prisons all over the country, and the IRA has basically ceased to exist. On the 6th of December, the Irish Free State is formally established as a dominion, 1 year after the treaty, and a week later the British are gone. They just get on their bikes and leave. And so on the 17th of December, General Macready gets on a ship, sails home, and 750 years of continuous occupation of Dublin is over. So the British have gone. Here they are marching out. Now, they're not completely gone from the Free State for a time. Remember, I talked a little bit about ports. There are still 3 ports in the Free State that have a British garrison. One is Lough Swilly up in Donegal, another is Berehaven, and the third is Spike Island, which they call Queenstown. Spike Island now, by the way, if you go to Ireland, they've really done a nice job of turning it into a museum with the coastal fortifications and stuff. You can go out there, and it's an interesting place to walk around. The Irish, they maintain control of these until 1938, when they negotiate with De Valera and finally leave those ports. They estimate in their post-war studies that not having access to those ports may have led to the death of 5,000 lives of merchant mariners from convoys during the Second World War. That remains a sore point for Anglo-British relations even today, or Anglo-Irish relations, excuse me. There are people who remember that, and they remember it. Ireland remained neutral in the Second World War, and the British didn't like it, and especially Churchill didn't like it. In conclusion, withdrawal took about a year, much longer than planned. They'd hoped to be out by spring, but they ended up keeping these forces in Dublin. And those forces in Dublin were actually a considerable risk. Most of them were living in tents in Phoenix Park. They were not in barracks. They could have been targets. And in that respect, I would say Britain got lucky. There were really strong reasons for the anti-treaty IRA to attack the British Army. They even had a vote over whether they should do that or not. There were attacks on British soldiers, but there weren't very many, and they were pretty sporadic. So in that respect, at least, I think the British got pretty lucky because they left a lot of people in very vulnerable positions for a long period of Macready managed the process carefully, and he avoided reigniting the war. And staring down Churchill is not an easy thing to do, historically. But most importantly, I think the British just fundamentally underestimated Irish determination to separate from the empire. They really, a lot of their planning had to do with how can we leverage these troops in some way. And the first and most important point for the Irish was to get the troops out. That's why they signed the treaty. So I think there was a fundamental miscommunication on that point, and that affected negotiations and the outcome of the war. Some long-term impact. Because from a British perspective, this worked relatively well, it may have reinforced the idea that partition is a good solution to political problems in the colonies. And that's going to come back to haunt them in the post-World War II phase. Because the first two big colonial problems Britain has are in Palestine and in India. And in both cases, they opt for partition as the solution. And they opt for a really rapid withdrawal of forces. Get them out. We're not going to worry about whether we're going to maintain leverage over the peace process or over the partition process. We just want to get out. That may have contributed to instability in both places. Because in both places, for the most part, people who wanted to fight sat and waited till the British were gone. And then they fought each other really, really, really hard in much uglier ways than you saw in the Irish Civil War. So that's my story for the moment. I'll be glad to take any questions you have about this or anything else. I know, I numbed you with history. I do think, though, one reason to think about this is if Ireland unifies, which I think is far more likely at this point than at any time in my life, one of the things that the British government is going to have to do is remove its remaining military installations from Northern Ireland. They have done it before. They probably won't do it this same way. It'll probably be somewhat different, but it's an interesting case study. And it's also, again, I think an interesting case study because it's the first. They have to do this a bunch more times after the Second World War as they leave each of their colonies. And we know that the experience in Ireland affected British Army doctrine in a number of different ways, both for conventional and unconventional war. But that the British didn't really study it in the interwar period. They only studied it when it got desperate in World War II. This may be a piece that they also studied or that they retained as kind of a good memory. It wasn't great for Ireland because Ireland had a civil war, but for the British, they got out fairly cleanly and they got a result they liked for the most part. This may have made them overconfident about other withdrawals in the future. Please.
Collins got killed in an ambush down in West Cork, right?
Yes, at Bale na Blah.
At that time, they were in the middle of the Civil War, right?
Yes.
What was Collins doing down there?
That's a great question, and I'm still not sure anybody actually knows the answer. We do have some of his letters and communications, and it appears that the IRA, the anti-treaty IRA had just announced its intent to retreat up into the hills and fight a guerrilla war. They weren't going to fight a conventional war anymore by mid-August. I think it's around the 15th that Lynch says, go back to the guerrilla struggle, that's what we're good at. Collins is Cork native. He knew a lot of the Cork commanders. Interestingly, there's a large proportion of the Cork IRA choose to be neutral in the conflict. Some of them, like Lynch and others, were anti-treaty. There weren't very many who were pro-treaty, but a number of them formed a group actually called the Neutral IRA, led by Flory O'Donoghue, who'd been one of the intelligence officers in the Cork Brigade, and I think eventually for the 1st Southern Division. But in any event, it appears Collins felt like he could work out a compromise and get everybody to dump arms. Collins had been close with Lynch. They had great respect for each other. I think he was trying to approach people who could be intermediaries to Lynch. And since Lynch had been sort of recalcitrant about going to war up through the four courts, they were hoping they could talk him back into a more peaceful zone. I think that's what he was doing. Emmett Dalton, who was sitting next to him in the staff car when the ambush took place, Dalton's order to the driver was, drive on through, don't stop. And Collins said, no, we'll fight them. So in that respect, Collins got out of the car into a gunfight, which was not something he had done much in the War of Independence, and was killed by an unfortunate shot. I think the intent was that he would drive around Cork and try and make contact with people he knew and try and arrange some kind of a ceasefire. That seems to have been the intent. It's a bold move for someone who is the functional equivalent of the chief executive of the Irish Provisional Government. He probably shouldn't have been leading from the front. But if he didn't lead from the front, he wouldn't have been Michael Collins. So, Jim.
I was aware of certain executions that took place during the war, but 86, I didn't realize the number was quite that high. How were they conducted? Was it spread around the country, or?
Yeah, there are some famous ones that happened early. Erskine Childers was executed for possession of a firearm in November of 1922. Childers had been a really major player in the War of Independence. He'd helped run guns to Howth in 1914. I mean, he was an iconic figure, but he was also English, and he had made people very, very angry at him. And it's ironic that he was executed for possession of a firearm when the firearm was given to him by Michael Collins. There were 4 unlawful executions after the attack that killed Senator Hales on the 7th of December. There are then 4 people who are executed in retribution. There's no legal proceeding. Liam Mellows, Rory O'Connor, Dick Barrett, Joe McKelvey. One of them is from each province of Ireland, so there may have been an intentional geographic intent there. They were leaders of the anti-treaty faction that had seized the 4 courts. But it's really in that January to April period where it gets nasty, where they are, for the most part, assassinating people with volunteers with little rank or standing. They're just normal folks. But they are trying to make sure that in every county where there's Republican resistance, there are some executions that take place. And my friend Gareth Pendergrast, who may or may not be coming to talk to us, he's just written a very good book called Clear, Hold, and Build on the Irish Civil War. But his hypothesis, and I think he's right, is the local IRA commanders would hold people hostage, basically, and then they'd go to families and they'd say, look, we know your son Liam is up in the hills, and we've got your younger son Michael here. And if Liam doesn't stop what he's doing, we're gonna have to shoot Michael. I mean, I think it got to be that kind of nasty coerciveness. And it was effective. You can see violence in the countryside dropping very significantly. After January, there's a temporary stay of executions in February, and then they accelerate again in March. So it's a deliberate and harsh policy on the part of the government, and one that they spent a lot of time trying to recover from afterwards. The 86 figure, I think, comes from Ernest Blythe, who was one of the ministers. But I think there are more. There are people who disappeared on both sides who have never really been accounted for as well. But there were 86, I think, were official government executions of prisoners. So, yeah. Oh, that was upbeat. Any happier questions?
How about them Red Sox?
How about them Red Sox? Yeah, anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate your patience and always enjoy speaking to you all.